Well, we're running a little late, so I'm going to try to make this quite a bit briefer than my predecessors, who were both brilliant. Don't you think so? And I'm going to focus a bit on statecraft. Question is, what would Ronald Reagan think of Europe today? And I want to put this in the context of history. We had Krista Muth talk to us earlier about Reagan and John Paul and the events of and today as a following from the revolution of 1989. But I'd like to suggest that at least for Ronald Reagan, in terms of statecraft, we look back to 1946 and 7 and 8. Because the president who Reagan most admired, and this will come as a surprise, I suspect, for many here, was Franklin Roosevelt. And the world that was created right after the Second World War was very much a world that reflected Franklin Roosevelt. The other president he most admired was Dwight Eisenhower, was very much an acolyte of Franklin Roosevelt. And that world was led to an American policy that was determined not to reshape institutions and events so there would not be another general European war. The United States had been pulled into two of these in the 20th century. By the midpoint of the 20th century, the determination of American leaders was there wouldn't be a third. Even as the Soviet Union was rising from being an ally in the Second World War to being a clear adversary, something that in private conversation Franklin Roosevelt acknowledged to aides and said he couldn't do anything about it. So in that world, part of the American solution was to have prosperity, general prosperity in Europe, not the kinds of dislocations that had followed the First World War. And the answer to that was a customs union and a broad economic revival. Economic revival being reflected in the Marshall Plan, other policies like that. The unity being reflected in security unity with NATO, and economic unity beginning with the European Iron and Steel Community. That is seen as a European project, that second one. In fact, in many respects, it was an American project. Men like John J. McCloy, who was the American High Commissioner of Germany, and George W. Ball, who was an aide to Jean Monnet, were instrumental in bringing it about. But it was a very different concept than we're looking at today in the European Union. It was, as I think Professor Labucco said, a Europe of states, not of a superstate. It was never conceived in that time as what has emerged, this kind of increasingly authoritarian economic and, in many respects, political entity that overrides elections and does other things of that sort. Ronald Reagan was very much in that frame, a Europe of states, not a superstate. And that was the American consensus. We heard our second speaker of the day, after Krista Muth, say that for an American, the idea of the rise of a kind of woke, we would say, totalitarianism just seems to be a foreign, an unimaginable threat. You come over here and you quickly find it's not at all unimaginable if you're an American, and what's happening in our own country looks much more sinister. But nevertheless, Ronald Reagan and we in the White House, Philip, myself, and so many others, were focused in the period of the Reagan administration on holding Europe together so that in a united front against the Soviet Union. Margaret Thatcher was key in this, but so were other leaders, even President Mitterrand, Chancellor Kohl, Prime Minister Mulroney in Canada. We had a group of leaders, plus, most importantly, John Paul II, who understood that there was a threat to civilization and a need for unity, maintaining unity and even strengthening unity in opposition to it, at a time when, in fact, we were following a period in which that unity had broken down. This was the challenge of that time. Where would President Reagan be today? I think he'd be very much where Prime Minister Thatcher was in 1988 at the time of her Bunge speech in Belgium, in which she said that there was, we meaning the British, had not, and suggesting all the West, had not given up, had not thrown off the shackles of regulation and creeping state control nationally to adopt something that was transnational, of the same character. She warned against a superstate of regulation. Ronald Reagan would have been right there. In fact, he was. I'll say this in end. We regarded the American economic renaissance of that period as having, I think I'm confident in saying the president felt this, as having had a salutary effect on Europeans. That the example of a vigorous free market democracy expanding rapidly had put a brake on that movement among European countries. The problem is, and would have been for him had we moved beyond, had he been around beyond the period we were working in, the problem was that what was national became transnational at a time when we needed stronger nations, not a stronger superstate.